Flumzis, a DIY robot that improves student performance during study nights. Our team is made of Sebastian Caballa, Jose Cortazar, Midori Sanchez, and Roberto Raez. 59% of adults aged 18 to 29 tag themselves as night owls. Not sleeping the recommended number of hours reduces our abilities and alters our behavior. Particularly in our country, university students tend to study during the morning because their time to do their homework and study is not enough during the day. In order to help, we decided to develop Flumzis. Flumzis is proposed to optimize study performance and prevent health deterioration of users. Flumzis complements the method of study of each person, making it more efficient to reduce the night study time. During the night, it gives an advice on how to eat healthy. Also, it gives study techniques to improve the retention of information and methods to organize your time when studying. Also, Flumzis has been designed so that it can be easily manufactured and assembled. How Flumzis optimize the study sessions? Well, over the night, it gives advice and motivational phrases to optimize the study sessions. For example, to facilitate learning, try to combine visual and auditory memorization, or remember to do self-assessments. Flumzis promote healthy eating habits to maintain energy during the night. From time to time, it tells the student that he should consume some kind of fruit, like apples or bananas, or dried fruit, instead of energy drinks based on caffeine. Through his screen, he shows you different gifs indicating what you should consume. The optimal study time is within 18 to 20 minutes. Hence, Flumzis tells the user when to take a break and when to return to study, following the recommended time. It tracks your effective study time for 20 minutes and reminds you to take breaks of 5 minutes with some alerts like movements and sounds. It was designed to be manufactured with a 3D printer and uses laser cutting for the internal parts. Its design has lips and lace so that it can be easily assembled without using screws. In addition, it can be programmed on an Arduino platform, which uses simple programming language and flexible hardware. Flumzis has four main forms of human-robot interactions. Its eyes indicate different states of its mood, with several colors. For example, to take a break with red, return to study with green, to eat some snack with yellow, among others. Secondly, a sensor is placed in Flumzis' head. It works in order to notify Flumzis when the user heard the alarm sound and stop it. Also, when Flumzis wants to tell something, it makes a special sound to attract the attention of the user. Finally, the screen shows different images for some advice or notifications, and textually shows you some recommendations. In conclusion, Flumzis is a powerful learning tool about robotics and programming, a companion to study for overnight, and it's friendly in order to strengthen the relationship with the user. Actually, we are starting some tests to measure and quantify the impact on the study night. We want to thank Sala Veo 3D, the digital manufacturing lab of our university, for providing us with the necessary resources to carry out this project. Well, that's all. Thank you.